The rain came sideways across the airfield, slicing through the gray like a punishment. It wasn't the soft drizzle England was known for. It was a relentless metallic downpour that made every movement feel like defiance. The men of the 12th Experimental Squadron waited in their cockpits, half believing, half regretting ever signing the paperwork. Somewhere beyond the fog, the channel breathed and sighed, hiding the war that had already devoured so many better men. The hangars looked like tombs. Mechanics crawled under canvas sheets, tools clinking in frustration as the storm drenched everything it touched. One man, his face streaked with oil and rain, looked up at the strange wing that hung over him. Broad, too broad, like a glider that had forgotten how to die gracefully. "It'll never fly straight," he muttered. Another answered through the wind. "Doesn't have to. Just has to fly different." But that word, different, was an accusation here, not a virtue. At the edge of the runway, Squadron Leader Arthur Hawk Sloan watched the clouds the way gamblers study dice. He wasn't supposed to believe in this design. He'd been trained on the old rules: narrow wings, speed over lift, doctrine over experiment. Yet something in him ached at the logic of those curves, the silent arrogance of the machine built to break the pattern. Behind him, the control tower radio crackled with the static of indecision. Higher command had called this entire effort a distraction from proven models. The pilots called it worse. They said it was suicide by geometry. Still, the wings gleamed. The new Supermarine configuration, the so-called C-wing, carried a shape born from argument. Its wide span was an insult to the purists, its thicker profile a betrayal of the old Spitfire's poetry. It looked heavy, clumsy, unbalanced, and until you touched it, then you felt the subtle bend, the hidden logic beneath its skin. Reginald Merton's fingerprints were on every rivet, every curve calculated for endurance, not elegance. Engines coughed to life, stuttering against the weather. Propeller blades blurred into gray halos, slicing rain into mist. Inside the cockpit, Sloan gripped the throttle and felt the vibration crawl up his arm, an untested creature stirring under his command. Around him, his squadron waited for clearance that never came. Orders were muddled, command uncertain whether to waste fuel on a concept flight. And yet, as the wind cut across the airfield, the decision made itself. Sloan eased the throttle forward. The aircraft shuddered, groaned, then began to move. Not gracefully, but deliberately, like a wounded animal that refused to lie down. The others followed, one by one, engines screaming into unity. In the tower, a voice tried to recall them. Static drowned it out. The storm swallowed sound as the first of the new wings lifted from the earth. It rose slower than expected, then steadied, slicing into the gray. Below, the skeptics stood frozen, their laughter drowned beneath the engine's roar. And for the first time, silence meant belief. In the years after the Battle of Britain, the Royal Air Force stood tall upon its own legend. The victories of 1940 had hardened into scripture, and scripture had turned into bureaucracy. Within the marble corridors of the Air Ministry, success had become a fossil, polished, admired, but no longer alive. Committees met not to discover, but to defend what had already been proven. Every new design was forced to kneel before the altar of standardization. Anything unorthodox was quietly buried beneath paperwork, as if imagination itself were a liability. The doctrine was simple and sacred. Tight-wing Spitfires ruled the sky because they were small, light, and precise. The formula had worked once, and in wartime, repetition felt like safety. Engineers who strayed from that geometry were labeled idealists, dreamers who forgot the price of fuel and the math of production. Yet the front lines were changing faster than doctrine could adapt. The Luftwaffe had begun testing new high-altitude interceptors, faster and deadlier than before, while the RAF's internal memos still debated the thickness of paint on a standard A-wing. At Castle Bromwich, the air hummed with the rhythm of drills and typewriters. Amid the noise, Reginald Merton sat alone under the glare of a single lamp, hands blackened with graphite. His sketches sprawled like battle plans across the drafting table, arcs, curves, airfoil experiments, each line an argument against the ministry's obsession with sameness. Merton wasn't young anymore. He had built wings since the days when biplanes trembled like birds. But now experience had become his curse. Every idea was questioned, every deviation met with bureaucratic scripture. If it worked in 1940, it will work again. Across the hangar, a test pilot named Arthur Sloan watched him work. Sloan was everything the RAF loved: disciplined, decorated, and intolerant of nonsense. Yet even he could feel the weight of complacency pressing down. The manuals told him to trust the system. The skies told him otherwise. He had seen German fighters twist through cloud banks at angles his Spitfire could never match. The air war was becoming a duel of mathematics, and Britain was still fighting with pride instead of probability. The first time Merton showed Sloan the drawings, the pilot just stared. The new wing was wider, thicker, heavier, an insult to the sleek perfection of the Spitfire silhouette. "It'll bleed speed," Sloan said quietly. Merton nodded. "It'll also hold fuel longer, climb higher, and keep its guns stable at full roll." Logic clashed with instinct in that moment, the engineer's world of equations against the pilot's feel for flight. Both men were right, and that was the problem. The Air Ministry rejected Merton's proposal twice. They called it unnecessary complexity in an era demanding simplicity. The memos carried polite venom, not in line with established performance doctrine. Those words became a shield for fear. Fear of wasting resources, fear of embarrassment, fear of being wrong after being so triumphantly right. The RAF had forgotten that victory was supposed to be temporary, not tradition. And yet, Merton persisted. He wasn't fighting for glory. He was fighting against stagnation. He believed that survival in the air depended on elasticity, not rigidity, the same trait that made steel strong. Its ability to bend before it broke was what doctrine had lost. By late 1941, as reports of German tactical evolution piled higher on desks, whispers began to circulate. Perhaps the perfection of 1940 was already obsolete. A quiet panic settled in the ministry, the realization that innovation, once dismissed, might soon be demanded. But by then, Merton's design was already waiting, unapproved, untested, and unstoppable in the logic of the air, because physics doesn't salute rank, and the sky was about to prove it. The hangar at Castle Bromwich never slept. It only changed its color, daylight glare fading to the amber hum of bulbs that swung in the draft, dust dancing in their wake like restless ghosts. Beneath that glow, Reginald Merton hunched over a sheet of tracing paper so crowded with lines it looked like a battlefield of geometry. He'd been there since dusk, drawing the same arc again and again, the graphite wearing through the paper's skin. To the others it was madness. To him, it was gravity itself speaking, whispering the truth that wings didn't have to obey what men thought they knew. The new design stretched wider than any Spitfire before it. The curve, elliptical, proud, deliberate, promised smoother lift at altitude and room enough to house 4 20mm cannons in perfect alignment. But in the cold arithmetic of the ministry, every inch of wingspan was heresy. A larger surface meant drag. Drag meant slower turns meant death. Merton's reply was always the same. Drag doesn't kill pilots. Stalls do. His colleagues exchanged looks, smirks behind their rationed cigarettes. To them, he was an academic dreaming of equations while real men bled in the air. Yet Merton's nights were filled not with dreams but the sounds of failure. He could hear rivets snapping under test pressure, metal skins buckling when wind tunnels screamed beyond tolerance. The smell of burnt lubricant clung to his coat. Each failure went into a notebook, not as defeat but as data. He'd measure the fracture lines, chart the stress vectors, and start again. Creation and collapse danced endlessly, One could not exist without the other. The wing that was meant to stay aloft seemed determined to fall apart first. During one such night, Sloan entered quietly, his flight boots echoing across the concrete. He found Merton asleep on his arms, ink pooled beneath his cheek. The drawings beneath him looked alive, layers of iteration spiraling toward something both graceful and brutal. Sloan studied the curves. "You'll get yourself sacked for this," he said softly. Merton stirred, eyes red. "If they sack me, they'll still have to burn the paper, and the paper will fly before they do." By dawn, the prototype stood in skeletal form, ribs exposed, wires trailing like veins. The mechanics called it Merton's mistake. Even painted in factory primer, it looked heavy, a creature designed for the wrong sky. When the first test run began, everyone came to watch. Engines roared. The wing shuddered, and for a moment it lifted, catching the air with strange steadiness. Before a thunderclap of metal ended the illusion, the left aileron snapped clean off, the aircraft tumbling back to earth in a groan of torn alloy. Silence followed, then laughter from the back of the crowd. One of the engineers muttered, "Told you. Too clever for its own good." That night, Merton wrote in his logbook, "Failure number T47. Structure held longer than expected. Adjustment. Reinforce spar. Reduce flutter angle by 3 degrees. To him, that was victory. Every collapse taught him how the sky wanted to be negotiated with, not conquered. He was learning its language, one shattered propeller at a time. Weeks turned into months. Memos arrived stamped rejected. Prototypes were quietly dismantled for scrap. Merton kept salvaging pieces, re-riveting them by hand. He sold his car for aluminum sheets, traded his own watch for access to test instruments after hours. The others called it obsession. He called it duty. "The air is evolving faster than we are," he told Sloan once, voice barely above the hum of generators. "If we don't adapt, the next generation of pilots will die flying yesterday's certainties." By early 1942, the impossible blueprint had taken its final shape. The reinforced spar, the curved leading edge, the gun bays aligned like a single heartbeat, all of it assembled in defiance of doctrine. When the finished wing was wheeled into the open, morning light ran across its surface, revealing a quiet symmetry. It no longer looked heavy. It looked inevitable, and yet no orders came. No approval. No funding. The hangar door closed again. The wing left in darkness, a ghost built out of mathematics and defiance. Then, one cold afternoon, a telegraph arrived from the Mediterranean Command. Stamped urgent, aircraft losses unsustainable, require immediate innovation for high-altitude escort. A chance had arrived, one the skeptics could never have predicted. By the summer of 1942, the island of Malta was less a fortress and more a wound. Every dawn began with the same sound, the moan of air raid sirens swallowed by the roar of German engines. Supply lines were starving, pilots flying 2, sometimes 3 sorties a day on machines patched together from wreckage. The air above the Grand Harbor had turned into a crucible, where doctrine and desperation burned side by side. The cables from Malta arrived in London like cries through static. We are being outclimbed, outturned, outgunned. The Luftwaffe's Bf-109Fs owned the sky, their slender frames cutting through the Mediterranean heat like knives. Every RAF interception cost more lives, more aircraft, and more faith. But buried in one of those reports, a single line caught the attention of a logistics officer with too much conscience and too little authority. "We will take anything that can stay airborne and shoot straight." That was enough. In a back corner of Castle Bromwich, Merton's discarded prototype still gathered dust beneath tarpaulins. Officially, they did not exist. Unofficially, they were all that was left to try. Late one night, the hangar doors opened without authorization. A small team, engineers, mechanics, and a single sympathetic quartermaster, began crating the wings. Each section was labeled under false inventory numbers, destined for testing materials. What they were really sending was rebellion in wooden boxes. When the freighter reached Malta 2 weeks later, the airfield crews stared in disbelief. The wings were monstrous compared to the slender Spitfires they knew. Broader, heavier, painted in primer gray. "You've sent us a flying barn door," one mechanic muttered. But there was no time to argue with England. The siege had stripped them of pride. If it could fly, it would fight. They worked through the nights, cannibalizing wrecks, bolting Merton's wings onto battered Spitfire fuselages. The fit wasn't perfect. Bolts misaligned, fuel lines mismatched, but necessity had its own kind of precision. Sparks flew from acetylene torches. Hands bled from stripped rivets. The smell of hot metal mixed with sea salt and diesel. These weren't engineers anymore. They were surgeons operating in chaos, keeping a dying patient alive. When the first hybrid machine rolled out onto the cracked runway, its silhouette drew laughter from those who still had energy to mock. "Ugly thing," someone said. "Looks like it wants to fall apart before it takes off." The pilot, a wiry Canadian volunteer named Steele, climbed in without a word. The engines coughed, spat smoke, then steadied into a rough hum. The aircraft taxied forward, dragging the hopes of an entire island behind it. From his office in England, Merton heard the news through a coded message not meant for him. His design, the one they'd refused to fund, refused to name, was airborne over Malta. And when those engines roared above the Grand Harbor, the world's opinion changed in 19 minutes. The sun over the Mediterranean was brutal that morning. Blinding, merciless, turning the sea below into a mirror that punished every glance. 2 Spitfires, bearing wings wider than any that had flown before, climbed through the glare, their engines strained but steady. The air shimmered with heat and tension. They weren't meant to be here, not on official record, not in any RAF communique. They were ghosts with call signs. Yet above the blue, ghosts were exactly what Malta needed. Radar picked up movement 20 miles north, a formation of Ju-88 bombers, 12 strong, with fighter escort. The call came through. Interception immediate. Squadron Control's voice cracked with exhaustion, the kind that came from months of defense on the edge of starvation. 2 contacts only? Someone asked. "That's all we've got," came the answer. The 2 pilots exchanged a look across the comms, Steele in the lead, Harland on his wing. The sky ahead pulsed with black dots growing larger by the second. Steele's hand tightened on the throttle, sweat trickling down his glove. "Let's see if the professor's wings hold," he muttered. The climb began. To any observer on the ground, the motion seemed impossible. The broad sea wings didn't slice the air, they gripped it. Where the old Spitfire would have begun to stall, these new wings caught a current of invisible lift, converting drag into stability. The aircraft rose like a hawk on an updraft, its shadow shrinking across the sea. The Ju-88 spotted them too late. Defensive gunners opened fire, tracer rounds streaking downward in red arcs that burned out before they reached their mark. Steele's voice was calm now, steady, almost reverent. "Stay on me, Harland. Watch your torque." The 2 Spitfires rolled into a dive, then curved sharply upward beneath the bombers' bellies. A maneuver forbidden by every manual written before this day. The German gunners overshot. Their arcs of fire crossed each other uselessly. Steele pulled up into the blinding sun and inverted. The world turned on its head, blue replaced by silver. From the cockpit he saw the bombers framed perfectly below, 12 fat targets lumbering through the air. He pressed the trigger. 4 Hispano cannons barked in unison, their recoil vibrating through the frame like a heartbeat. The wing's rigidity held true. Not a shudder, not a tremor. Shells ripped through aluminum and fuel tanks. A Ju-88 flamed out instantly, peeling away in a trail of black smoke that curled like ink into the clouds. From below, a German pilot watched in disbelief. The British fighter should have been slow, heavy, doomed in a turning fight. Yet it danced, rolling left, right, spiraling through gunfire with mechanical grace. He radioed something that barely reached command. The wide ones climbed too fast. Harlan lined up his own run, his cannons stitching bright threads across the sky. The bombers broke formation, panic dissolving discipline. Steele dove again, his voice tight with wonder. "She's steady as a rock," he said. "Feels like she wants the fight." Then silence, the kind only pilots know when everything mechanical becomes instinct. For 19 minutes, the Mediterranean became a proving ground. 2 Spitfires dismantled an entire raid. 4 bombers destroyed, 2 limping home. Not a single British loss. As Steele's plane leveled over the sea, his radio clicked once more. "They can't touch us," he said, half laughing, half stunned. In that moment, Merton's impossible geometry had found its purpose. The wing nobody believed in had turned theory into dominance. But as the pilots returned to base, engines humming with victory, a message was already en route to London. Success in the field was not the same as acceptance in Whitehall. The telegrams from Malta landed on the mahogany desks of the Air Ministry with all the weight of an inconvenience. They spoke of victory, of improbable performance, of enemy losses that didn't fit the models. But to the men in pressed uniforms and polished shoes, it was statistical noise, an anomaly to be explained away, not embraced. Success without authorization was, to them, failure in disguise. When Merton returned from Castle Bromwich, he was greeted not with applause but a summons. The ministry boardroom smelled of tobacco and skepticism. A colonel leaned across the table, tapping the report with a pencil. "You shipped unapproved prototypes into a combat zone," he said. Merton met his gaze unflinching. "And they came back alive." The room went still. Behind the polished decorum, no one wanted to admit the truth. The experiment had worked, but not under their control. The audit began. Endless pages of forms, inquiries about material usage, accusations of insubordination dressed up as procedure. The same hands that had once praised his precision now pointed to his defiance. Bureaucracy had its own battlefield, and here logic was the first casualty. Outside those walls, the pilots who had flown his design wrote their own reports, raw, unpolished, full of gratitude. "Stability in a climb saved my life over Valletta," one read. "Held fire steady through evasive roll," said another. Their words carried no mathematical weight, only human truth. And that was precisely what the ministry feared most. Emotion was uncontrollable. Numbers could be contained. Sloane visited Merton one evening, finding him in the drafting room again, surrounded by silence and paper. The prototypes had been seized for evaluation. On his desk sat a small brass plaque stamped classified, not to be repeated. The irony wasn't lost on either man. Sloane ran a hand over the new blueprints, unapproved designs for an even lighter spar system. "They'll bury this too," he said. Merton gave a weary smile. "Then they'll dig it up when it's too late." Word spread quietly through engineering circles, and the wing was a success nobody wanted to admit. A victory that embarrassed its own institution. In pubs near Birmingham, test pilots whispered about Merton's madness, half in reverence, half in warning. For those who had touched his machine, faith had replaced doubt. But for those who ruled by paperwork, faith was heresy. Still, the war pressed on, indifferent to politics. Each new German advance brought reports of aircraft that looked disturbingly familiar. Longer wings, improved roll control, optimized high-altitude performance. The Luftwaffe had learned from its losses. They had studied the wreckage of Malta and understood what London refused to see. Merton's designs remained locked away, stamped and forgotten. Yet even buried beneath ink and secrecy, truth has a way of resurfacing. The sky was changing again, and soon, even London couldn't ignore the skies above Tunisia. Winter of 1942 brought silence to the Mediterranean, the kind that only follows exhaustion. The skies, once thick with duels, were calmer now, but in the quiet came something colder. Observation. Somewhere in a hangar outside Augsburg, German engineers huddled around the charred remains of a British aircraft hauled from the Sicilian coast. Its wings were twisted, its fuselage broken, but its secrets were intact. On the metal surface they traced the unfamiliar curvature, the thicker spar, the strange alignment of cannon ports. Notes were scribbled in clipped, efficient handwriting. Increased rigidity without loss of lift. The English lifting miracle. The phrase would echo through the Luftwaffe's technical memos for months. The Reich's engineers, methodical as surgeons, began to model their own variations. Broader-winged 109 prototypes, heavier yet more stable. Innovation had crossed the front lines, carried not by spies but by wreckage. British intelligence intercepted fragments of these communications. At first, Whitehall dismissed them as propaganda. Then the photos arrived. Grainy reconnaissance images of enemy aircraft bearing unnervingly familiar wing geometry. Suddenly, the same officials who had buried Merton's work began ordering his blueprints by the crate. The tone of their memos changed overnight. Reassessment required for sea configuration benefits. No mention of Malta, no mention of defiance, only a quiet, bureaucratic panic disguised as procedure. Merton was called back not with apology but with urgency. The same men who once accused him of insubordination now asked for production timelines and stress tolerances. He answered in silence, opening his old notebooks where graphite scars had become proof. Doctrine had collided with pragmatism, and pragmatism was bleeding. In testing fields across England, squadrons reassembled the forgotten design, this time with official funding and fanfare. The irony was almost mathematical. The wing once mocked as unfit for war was now Britain's best answer to the next one. And in a briefing room heavy with cigarette smoke, Sloan leaned over a map of North Africa, tracing enemy movements that mirrored the rise of new German variants. "They've learned from us," he said quietly. Merton nodded. "Then they've forced us to learn from ourselves." The weapon they rejected had now become the shield they needed. Dawn over Sicily arrived. In a haze of dust and salt, a horizon, bruised with smoke from the beaches below. The invasion had begun. Allied bombers droned in long silver chains above the coastline, their bellies heavy with ordnance, their shadows stretching across the Mediterranean like scars. Behind them, flying guard at 10,000 feet, came the new squadron. Sea-wing Spitfires, no longer secret, no longer mocked. The machines that had once been ghosts now bore the weight of history on their broad, gleaming wings. Arthur Sloan led them. Callsign Hawk 1. Through his canopy, the sky shimmered like molten glass. He could see the bombers ahead, lumbering targets moving toward flak clouds rising from Messina. Below, Italian gun positions flashed like camera bulbs. Over the radio came the clipped words, "Bandits 11 o'clock high." Out of the sun they appeared. Messerschmitt 109s diving fast, black crosses glinting. Doctrine said Spitfires couldn't meet them head-on at that altitude. But Doctrine had never flown Merton's design. Sloan pushed the throttle until the Merlin engine screamed, then pulled back, feeling the wings bite into the air. The aircraft didn't resist. It rose as if remembering what it was built for. Tracer fire stitched through the sky, glowing threads in a tapestry of chaos. A bomber exploded below, scattering debris like shrapnel rain. Sloan rolled inverted, gravity pressing hard, the world flipping upside down. The Sea-wing held, steady, obedient, as he pulled into a descending corkscrew. A 109 passed across his sightline. He squeezed the trigger. The cannons thundered, recoil shivering through the frame. The enemy disintegrated into smoke and falling metal. Every motion now was geometry, arcs, pivots, spirals, not instinct but design manifest. The extended firing arc of the Sea-wing allowed precision impossible in earlier models. Sloan's Spitfire became something more than a machine, a compass of pure calculation. He dove again, the air screaming around the fuselage, then climbed almost vertically, a maneuver pilots once swore physics forbade. But the wing held its lift like a promise kept. Over the radio came bursts of disbelief. "They're climbing with us," a German pilot shouted before static swallowed his voice. Another dove too late, torn apart by converging lines of British fire. Below, ground troops looked up to see contrails twist and knot above them, like white ribbons in a duel of gods. The air smelled of oil and cordite, every second stretching into eternity. Sloan's squadron cut through the Axis defense like blades through fabric. In 20 minutes, 15 enemy aircraft fell burning into the sea. When it was over, the silence hit hardest. The kind of silence that follows vindication. The bombers reached their targets. The invasion pushed forward. Over the comms came the voice of a flight controller from Malta, almost reverent. "Good show, Hawk Squadron. Command sends its compliments." In London, those same words echoed up the chain of command. The official communique spoke for the first time of enhanced wing performance and operational superiority. Merton's design, once buried under ridicule and red tape, now appeared in headlines as innovation reborn. Photographs of the broad-winged Spitfires filled newspapers with pride. But while glory returned to the skies, its architect receded from them. Merton did not attend the briefings, nor answer the congratulatory letters. In his office at Castle Bromwich, he sat alone among drafting tables cleared of blueprints, the last sketches folded neatly away. For him, victory had never been about applause. It was about the simple, relentless truth of the air, and now that truth belonged to others. Beneath the glory, Merton had already begun his withdrawal, from the sky, and from history. When the war ended, the machines fell silent long before the men did. Airfields turned from crucibles to graveyards, their runways littered with ghosts of innovation. Merton stood among them only once, hands in his pockets, the wind tugging at his coat. He was offered medals, commendations, public praise, all the trappings of victory. He refused everyone. "It wasn't mine to win," he said simply, and walked away. By 1946, he had vanished from the rolls of the Air Ministry. No public farewell, no speeches, no photographs shaking hands with generals. Instead, he took a job at a quiet engineering firm in Derby, designing suspension bridges and turbine housings. Machines built for endurance, not destruction. To the young draftsman who worked beside him, he was just Mr. Merton, precise, patient, distant. Only once did he speak of the war, when a colleague asked why he never returned to aircraft design. Merton looked at the sky through the workshop window and said, "Wings aren't built for war. They're built for trust." His notebooks, passed along after his death, revealed the mind that had changed aviation without seeking credit. Pages filled with reflections rather than equations. A wing is a promise, between the air and the man who dares to stand on it. Engineers who once dismissed him now quoted his stress diagrams in lectures, calling them ahead of their time. Textbooks redrew their schematics to match his principles. The irony was almost poetic. The man forgotten by history had become the foundation of it, and yet his absence was the measure of his humility. He seemed to understand that innovation was a relay, not a monument. He had run his stretch of the race and handed the baton to a future that would never know his name. Those who remembered him, Sloan among them, spoke of a quiet defiance that outlasted medals. He wasn't chasing glory, Sloan once said in an interview decades later. He was chasing truth, and truth doesn't need a parade. Merton's designs would go on to shape the next generation of aircraft. Though his name appeared only in footnotes, but perhaps his greatest victory was not the one in the air, but the doctrine that finally learned to listen. Time has a way of sanding down the edges of defiance until all that remains is doctrine. The ideas that once felt dangerous become accepted wisdom, and the names that risked everything to create them fade into the margins of footnotes. So it was with Merton's wing, the design that the RAF once buried under ridicule and red tape. Decades later, it became the very shape of modern flight. By the 1950s, a new generation of aircraft filled the skies. swept-wing jets slicing through the air at speeds Merton never lived to see. The F-86 Sabre, the MiG-15, the English Electric Lightning, each bore echoes of his philosophy. Wider control surfaces, structural flexibility, gun mounts aligned along load-bearing spars. Engineers credited evolution in aerodynamic understanding, but those who had known Merton recognized the handwriting in the wind. The ghost of his equations had traveled quietly from paper to prototype, from prototype to legacy. In flight schools, young pilots learned principles born from his defiance. Trust the air, not just the instruments. Feel the lift before you measure it. Manuals once written to enforce obedience now praised adaptability, the very instinct he was punished for. His heresy had become procedure. As aviation advanced, his influence deepened. The 1960s saw the dawn of supersonic travel, the 1980s composite materials and variable geometry wings, and today, aircraft with adaptive morphing systems, wings that shift shape mid-flight, carry Merton's DNA in their circuitry. The same idea that once filled a dim hangar at Castle Bromwich now lives inside code and carbon fiber, reshaping itself in real time to the rhythm of the air. But memory, like lift, is invisible until tested. In an archive room in London, a curator once found Merton's original sketches folded inside a file marked obsolete. The pencil lines were faint, the equations smudged, but the vision was unmistakable. On one corner, written in his small, patient handwriting, "Form must earn its purpose." That single sentence became the motto of the Royal Aeronautical Society decades later. He never heard them say it. There's a strange comfort in that, the idea that truth outlives the hands that wrote it. Innovation rarely announces itself. It hides in arguments, in sleepless nights, in failed tests that one day define a generation. Merton's wing had never been about war. It was about understanding how far the line between chaos and control could bend before it broke, and what kind of courage it took to stand on that line. In documentaries, his story is rarely told. His name appears briefly in a footnote beneath the photographs of Operation Husky, beneath the gleaming silhouettes of the Sea-Wing Spitfires that turned disbelief into doctrine. Yet every pilot who banks through a cloud, every engineer who sketches a curve that doesn't fit the formula, continues his conversation with the sky. The footage fades, black and white film giving way to the color of a modern horizon. Jets trace thin white signatures across the blue, their wings flexing in subtle unseen rhythms. A narrator asks quietly, almost to himself, what if every miracle of flight begins with disbelief? The question hangs there, between history and the present, between what was proven and what was once impossible. And as the sky widens into silence, the final words linger like contrails dissolving in sunlight, the wing nobody believed in, until it shot down everything. Because true innovation is never about being right first. It's about daring to be wrong, until the world finally catches up.